In 1965, British viewers met a man they were not supposed to admire. He was loud, he was conservative, reactionary, and openly prejudiced in ways British television had rarely allowed before. He was usually wrong. He sat in his armchair in a small East End flat and shouted at his television. He shouted at his wife. He shouted at his daughter. He shouted at the Prime Minister, the immigrants, the Irish, the Jews, the Catholics, and the Queen. His name was Alf Garnett. Millions of people watched him. Some laughed at him. Some laughed with him. And that is why Till Death Us Do Part remains one of the most dangerous comedies the BBC has ever broadcast. The man who wrote Alf Garnett, Johnny Speight, believed he was creating a fool. The man who played Alf Garnett, Warren Mitchell, was a Jewish veteran of the Royal Air Force who held the opposite of every opinion the character expressed. The show drew complaints from campaigners, politicians, religious voices, and public bodies concerned with race relations and broadcasting standards. The campaigner Mary Whitehouse dragged the BBC through the courts. And yet, for 10 years on the BBC, then on ITV, then back on the BBC, then in 2 feature films, then in repeats that have never stopped, Alf Garnett refused to die. So this is the question we ask today, more than 60 years after Britain first met him. Was Alf Garnett a warning, or did television accidentally create a hero for the very attitudes it was trying to expose? Till Death Us Do Part was not, in 1965, expected to become anything important. It was commissioned as a 30-minute pilot for the BBC's Comedy Playhouse strand, the same low-cost, low-expectation showcase that had launched Steptoe and Son 3 years earlier. Comedy Playhouse was a half-hour experiment. Most of its pilots disappeared. A handful turned into series. The pilot was broadcast on the 22nd of July 1965. It was watched by millions of viewers. The BBC studied the figures, judged the reaction, and ordered a full series. The first series of 7 episodes was broadcast in the summer of 1966. The premise was, in 1965, almost shockingly simple. A working-class family in Wapping, East London. A father who was permanently angry about almost everything. A wife who barely listened to him. A daughter just old enough to disagree. A new son-in-law from Liverpool who was, in every possible respect, the father's opposite. Inside this small, cramped, badly papered front room, Johnny Speight placed every argument that Britain was, by 1965, having with itself. The argument over race. The argument over immigration. The argument over the welfare state, the argument over the Labour government, the argument over the royal family, the argument over the empire and what was left of it. And then there was the language. Television in 1965 was, by any modern standard, polite. The most controversial word that could be broadcast on the BBC at peak hours was damn. Alf Garnett used the word bloody in almost every sentence. He used the word bleeding almost as often. He used a list of racial slurs that, by the end of the show's first month on air, had reached the Director General's office. Inside the BBC, there was already nervousness. Outside the BBC, the war was about to begin. The audience that tuned in to Till Death Us Do Part in 1966 met 4 characters who would, between them, define British sitcom for the next decade. Alf Garnett was the head of the family. He was played by a Jewish actor from Stoke Newington called Warren Mitchell. The character was a dock worker, a Conservative voter, a West Ham supporter, an admirer of Winston Churchill, and a man permanently certain that everything had been better before. He was Johnny Speight's deliberate caricature of the kind of working-class reactionary Speight had grown up watching in the public houses of Canning Town. Speight repeated the same line about him for the next 30 years. I didn't invent Alf Garnett. He was created by society. I just grasped on him. Else Garnett was Alf's wife. She was played by a 58-year-old actress called Dandy Nichols. The role had originally been offered to Gretchen Franklin, an actress who later played Ethel Skinner in the BBC soap EastEnders. Franklin was contracted to a West End play in 1965 and could not break the contract. Nichols was offered the part at short notice. Her performance, almost invisible at first, became one of the great comic creations in British television. Elsie's silent indifference, her vague humming, her ability to deflate Alf's certainties with a single mumbled, silly old moo, became iconic. Rita Garnett, the daughter, was played by a 28-year-old former dancer from Welwyn Garden City called Una Stubbs. Rita was the audience's anchor. She loved her father. She did not agree with him. She rolled her eyes when he ranted, and she pushed back when he went too far. Stubbs would, in the end, play Rita 64 times across the original series, the 1981 ITV continuation, and the 1985 BBC revival. Mike Rawlins was the son-in-law from Liverpool. He was played by a working-class Labour activist from Liverpool called Anthony Booth. Mike was Alf's opposite, long-haired, socialist, atheist, and contemptuous of everything Alf stood for. Alf's nickname for him, Scouse Git, entered the English language. These were the four voices in the room. Around them, in 7 series across 10 years, came a rotating cast of supporting characters. Patricia Hayes played Elsie's neighbour, Min Reed. Alfie Bass, born Abraham Basilinsky to Jewish immigrant parents in the East End, played Min's husband, Bert, his real-life politics again the opposite of the character he portrayed. The Carry-On legend Joan Sims appeared 13 times as the family gran. Will Stamp played Fred the publican. Roy Kinnear, Pat Coombs, John Junkin and Bill Maynard rotated through as the pub regulars and the milkmen of Wapping. The 1969 feature film version added a young Brian Blessed, the veteran character actor Sam Kidd as a docker, and, in a casting note that would matter to Cinema Peak viewers, a young Frank Thornton as a Conservative Party canvasser. Thornton would, 3 years later, walk onto another BBC soundstage to film the pilot of Are You Being Served? And in 1972, the England football captain Bobby Moore, who 6 years earlier had lifted the World Cup at Wembley, appeared as himself in the episode Up the Hammers, alongside his 1966 World Cup teammates Alan Ball and Martin Peters, sharing a pub table with Alf. But none of these characters mattered, on their own, as much as the 4 voices in the front room of that Wapping flat. The audience came for the argument. The argument had 4 sides. The argument never stopped. To understand why Till Death Us Do Part exploded the way it did in 1966, we have to understand the Britain that was watching it. In the 20 years after the Second World War, Britain had changed almost beyond recognition. The British Empire, which in 1945 had still covered a quarter of the globe, was, by 1965, almost entirely gone. India had become independent in 1947. Most of British Africa had become independent between 1957 and 1964. The British economy had stopped growing in the way it had grown in the 1950s. The wartime generation was now in middle age, watching their children grow up in a country they no longer recognized. And then there was the question of immigration. In the years after 1948, hundreds of thousands of citizens of the former British Empire, from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from Pakistan, from India, had come to Britain under the British Nationality Act, which had granted them full British citizenship. They had worked on the trains, they had worked in the hospitals, they had worked in the factories, they had moved, often, into the same streets that Johnny Speight had grown up in. In 1965, the same year that the Till Death pilot was broadcast, the British Parliament passed the Race Relations Act. It was the first British law in history to ban discrimination on the basis of colour, race, or ethnic origin in public places. It established the Race Relations Board. It made the public expression of certain kinds of racial hatred a criminal offence for the first time. 3 years later, in April of 1968, the Conservative MP Enoch Powell delivered a speech in Birmingham that became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. Powell warned, in deliberately apocalyptic language, that continued Commonwealth immigration would tear Britain apart. He was sacked from the Conservative front bench within 24 hours. He received, in the following weeks, more than 100,000 letters of support from members of the public. A Gallup poll taken at the end of April found that 74% of the British public agreed with him. Alf Garnett, on screen, supported Enoch Powell. Some of the 20 million viewers who watched the show supported Enoch Powell too. They were not, in Johnny Speight's analysis, supposed to. The character of Alf was supposed to be a warning. Powell was supposed to be the joke. But the joke, in 1968, had become real. This is the context that made Till Death Us Do Part what it was. It was not, in the end, a sitcom about an armchair bigot. It was a sitcom about the bigotry of an entire country, and about the question of whether that country could laugh at itself, or whether it would, instead, laugh at the joke and miss the point entirely. This is the central question that Till Death Us Do Part raised, and it has never been answered. Johnny Speight's intention was, in his own words, unambiguous. The character of Alf Garnett was a fool. He was a man whose opinions were, almost without exception, wrong. He repeated, on television, the racial slurs and the political certainties that Speight had heard in the saloon bars of his childhood. He believed that the Labour Party was a communist conspiracy. He believed that the common market was a German plot. He believed that the working class had been better off under Winston Churchill. He believed all of these things with a confidence so total that, every week, his own family demolished his arguments in front of him. The structure of the show was built around this. Alf would deliver a 5-minute political tirade. His wife would ignore him. His daughter would push back. His son-in-law would dismantle the argument, point by point, using Alf's own logic against him. The audience, in Speight's design, was supposed to laugh at Alf for losing the argument. A significant proportion of the audience laughed at Alf for losing the argument. Another significant proportion of the audience did not. The evidence began to arrive within months of the first broadcast. Warren Mitchell received fan mail addressed to Alf Garnett. He received it in such volume that the BBC had to assign a member of staff to handle it. Members of the public approached him in the street and asked him to deliver lines from the show in character. They quoted Alf's political opinions back to him, approvingly, as if they were Mitchell's own. Speight responded by writing increasingly direct episodes. In 1967, he wrote an episode in which Alf was depicted as an admirer of Mary Whitehouse, proudly reading her first book, until, by the end of the episode, the book was being burnt. The satire was unmistakable. It did not change the minds of those viewers who had agreed with the original opinions. In the early 1970s, the situation became stranger still. Letters columns of British newspapers began to publish defences of Alf Garnett as a person. Working-class Conservative voters wrote to the BBC to say that Alf was the only character on British television who spoke for them. The 1972 episode in which Alf met the England football captain Bobby Moore in a pub became, in the days that followed, the subject of fan letters that thanked Moore for standing up for the ordinary British working man, although the episode had been written to satirise exactly that idea. Mitchell, by 1974, was being booked for public appearances at working men's clubs where the audience expected him to perform as Alf and deliver the character's racial and political opinions on stage. He refused these bookings. Some of the audiences who had paid for tickets were angry. Decades later, the BFI's Screen Online reference on race and the sitcom would summarise the problem with brutal clarity. The intention of Till Death Us Do Part was to satirise the attitudes of its central character. But when racism is depicted inside comedy, the line between the bigot and the victim can become very difficult to draw. The laughter does not always go where the writer intends it to go. Speight thought he was creating a fool. Some viewers thought he had created a spokesman. That gap between what the writer intended and what part of the audience received is the question that has followed Till Death Us Do Part for more than 60 years. It is the question we will return to in the final minutes of this video. Of all the contradictions inside Till Death Us Do Part, the deepest was the casting of its lead. Warren Mitchell was born Warren Meisel on the 14th of January 1926 in Stoke Newington in the north of London. His family were Orthodox Russian Jews. His grandmother had arrived in Britain in 1910, fleeing the pogroms of the Russian Empire, and had opened a fish and chip shop nearby. His father, Monty, was a glass and china merchant. His mother, Annie, died when Warren was 15. He attended a state grammar school in North London. He was clever. He won a place at University College, Oxford at the age of 17 to read physical chemistry on a 6-month short course that the Royal Air Force ran for potential officers. At Oxford, in the autumn of 1943, he met another undergraduate on the same scheme. The other man's name was Richard Burton. Mitchell and Burton became friends. In October 1944, the two of them together joined the Royal Air Force. Mitchell completed his navigator training in Canada just as the Second World War ended. This is the part of Mitchell's life that Cinema Peak has covered before in the documentary on the cast of The Longest Day. It will not be the focus today. What matters here is what came afterwards. After the war, Warren Meisel trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. He performed at Unity Theatre, the left-wing repertory company in North London. He married a Welsh actress called Constance Wake in 1951. He anglicised his surname from Meisel to Mitchell in the same year, a decision he later said he regretted. He spent 14 years working in radio comedy, in films, and on stage. He was 39 years old when Johnny Speight cast him as Alf Garnett. The reports from the original casting are consistent. Mitchell was the fourth choice for the role. Peter Sellers had been the first, Leo McKern the second, Lionel Jeffries the third. They all turned it down. The character was considered too unpleasant, too repulsive. Mitchell, a working actor with a wife and 3 children, took the part. What he did with it was, by general agreement, the finest piece of sustained character acting in the history of British sitcom. He won the BAFTA for Best Actor in 1967 for the role. He won 2 Laurence Olivier Awards for his stage work, in 1979 for Death of a Salesman and in 2004 for The Price. He was, simultaneously, a member of the British Humanist Association, a lifelong Labour Party supporter, a Tottenham Hotspur fan in a character who supported West Ham, and an outspoken opponent of every single political opinion his character was famous for. He defended the show for the rest of his life. He repeated in interview after interview the same line. Anyone who agreed with Alf had misunderstood the joke. He held both British and Australian citizenship. He died on the 14th of November 2015 at the age of 89 in London. The obituaries, on both sides of the Atlantic, made the same observation. The most famous anti-Semite in British television history had been played for 50 years by a Jewish veteran of the Royal Air Force. The most determined enemy of Till Death Us Do Part was not a politician. It was not a religious leader. It was not a member of the Race Relations Board. It was a 54-year-old former art teacher from Shropshire called Mary Whitehouse. In 1964, the year before the Till Death pilot was broadcast, Mary Whitehouse had launched a campaign called the Clean Up TV campaign, which, in 1965, became the National Viewers and Listeners Association. Her stated aim was the moral restoration of British broadcasting. Her practical method was to count. She counted swear words. She counted scenes of nudity. She counted depictions of violence. She counted depictions of anti-Christian content. She and her members watched the BBC and ITV with notebooks open, and she sent the results every week in long typed letters to the Director General. She wrote, Between 1966 and 1975, more than 200 letters of complaint about "Till Death Us Do Part" alone. In one famous tally, she logged 78 uses of the word bloody in a single 30-minute episode. The BBC, in private, took her seriously. Internal memoranda from the period, now held in the corporation's written archives, show producers and executives negotiating, sentence by sentence, with Johnny Speight, attempting to reduce the number of bloodies in his scripts. Speight, in almost every recorded case, refused. The bloodies stayed. In July of 1967, the war escalated. Johnny Speight made what he later described as a joke at the expense of Mary Whitehouse and her organisation in a BBC radio interview. He suggested, broadly, that Envala's worldview had something in common with fascism. Whitehouse sued for libel. Speight and the BBC paid substantial damages, and the corporation issued a full public apology. Whitehouse, who had spent 3 years being dismissed as a curiosity by the British media establishment, had won. The 1967 libel case changed the landscape. Until that moment, the producers of Till Death Us Do Part had treated Mary Whitehouse as a peripheral irritant, an opinionated former schoolteacher with a typewriter. After the case, she could no longer be dismissed. She had taken the BBC to court, and she had been paid. Her opinions on broadcasting policy were now, by force of law, opinions the corporation could not afford to ignore. This is the moment at which the argument over Till Death Us Do Part stopped being a private editorial discussion inside the BBC and became a national political question. Whitehouse appeared on television. She appeared in newspapers. She appeared at the conferences of the Conservative Party. The BBC, founded in 1922 on the principle that the broadcaster should reflect the moral seriousness of the British public, was being publicly accused by a woman with a notebook of corrupting the same public. The BBC did not, in the end, surrender. Till Death Us Do Part stayed on the air for another 8 years after the libel case. The bloodies stayed. The racial language, with some softening, also stayed. The argument over whether the show was satire or corruption was now public, and it was now permanent. By the late 1960s, Till Death Us Do Part had become impossible to ignore. The American television industry had noticed. In 1968, an American producer named Norman Lear flew to London. Lear was 46 years old. He had spent the 1950s and the 1960s writing for American comedy variety shows, and he had been looking for some years for a sitcom format that would let him address what he considered the great unspoken subject of American television in the late 1960s, the racial and political divisions tearing the country apart in the years after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Lear watched 3 tapes of Till Death Us Do Part. He went back to Los Angeles, bought the format rights from the BBC, and developed an American adaptation. The lead character became a working-class New Yorker living in Queens. The character was renamed Archie Bunker. The actor cast in the role was Carroll O'Connor. The show was called All in the Family. CBS broadcast the first episode on the 12th of January, 1971. The early ratings were modest. The reviews were divided. CBS considered cancelling the show before the end of its first season. It did not cancel the show. By the end of the second season, All in the Family was the most watched program in the United States. It remained the most watched program in the United States for 5 consecutive years. It won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series 4 times. It ran for 9 series. It produced 6 spin-off series, including The Jeffersons and Maude. By the late 1970s, Archie Bunker had become, in America, what Alf Garnett was in Britain, a working-class reactionary whom a significant part of the American audience took to their hearts. The same questions that Britain had asked about Alf Garnett were now being asked about Archie Bunker. Was the show satirizing bigotry or normalizing it? Was Carroll O'Connor's performance making racism look ridiculous or making it look acceptable? Norman Lear, like Johnny Speight, defended his creation for the rest of his life. The argument, like the British one, was never settled. The format crossed further borders. The show was remade in West Germany as Ein Herz und eine Seele and twice in the Netherlands. The German version featured a central character named Alfred Tetzlaff, deliberately designed as a parody of Adolf Hitler in the body of a Hamburg pensioner. The American version, All in the Family, would in turn inspire its own remake in Brazil. In every version, the central character was a working-class reactionary in an armchair. In every version, a part of the audience agreed with him. The character that Johnny Speight had created in a BBC office in 1965 had, by the end of the 1980s, been broadcast on 3 continents. The argument had gone global. By the end of 1975, the original Till Death Us Do part had run its course. 7 series, 54 episodes, 10 years of weekly arguments in the front rooms of Britain. Johnny Speight was 55 years old. Warren Mitchell was 49. Dandy Nichols was 68. The BBC, exhausted by a decade of internal arguments and external complaints, did not commission an 8th series. The last episode was broadcast on the 17th of December 1975. The story did not end there. In 1981, ITV commissioned a 6-episode continuation called simply Till Death. The format and most of the cast were the same. The title had to be changed because the BBC, having created Alf Garnett, still owned him. 4 years later, in 1985, the BBC took the character back. In Sickness and in Health, written again by Johnny Speight, brought Alf Garnett to the BBC for a second time. The show ran for 6 series until 1992. Dandy Nichols was originally to return as Els, but her health was failing. She suffered a fall in her flat in February 1986. She died 3 days later of pneumonia and heart disease at the age of 78. Speight, in an unusually direct piece of writing, incorporated Els Garnett's death into the show. Alf Garnett, for the remaining 6 years of In Sickness and in Health, was a widower. The character of Alf Garnett, taken as a single continuous creation, had, by the end of 1992, been on British television for 27 years. He had survived 5 prime ministers, Wilson, Heath, Callaghan, Thatcher and Major. He had survived 3 race relations acts. He had survived Mary Whitehouse, who in 1992 was 82 years old and still writing letters. He had survived the cast members who had played his neighbours, his publican, and his workmates. Some of the show's earliest episodes did not survive. The BBC, between 1967 and 1978, operated an internal videotape reuse policy under which old recordings were routinely wiped and the tape used to record new programmes. Many of the original black and white episodes, most of the first 3 series, were lost in this way. For decades, they were assumed gone forever. In 2022, the channel That's TV secured rights from the BBC and broadcast the surviving early episodes of the original series, including 4 that had been recovered from private collectors over the previous 2 decades. They had not been seen on British television for more than 50 years. The British audience that watched them in 2022 was almost entirely different from the audience that had watched them in 1966. The argument over what they meant was largely the same. A documentary about Till Death Us Do part cannot end without saying who, in the end, made it. Because the answer is, and this remains the deepest irony of the show, none of them was Alf Garnett. Johnny Speight, the man who put every word of Alf's bigotry on the page, was the son of a Roman Catholic Irish docker. He was born in Canning Town in 1920. He left school at 14. He served in the Territorial Army during the Second World War. He came back to the East End with a copy of George Bernard Shaw under his arm and spent the next 50 years writing satire against the kind of working-class racism he had grown up watching. He died of cancer in 1998 at the age of 78 in Hertfordshire. His political opinions were the opposite of Alf's. They had always been. Warren Mitchell, who played Alf for 27 years, was a Jewish Royal Air Force navigator trainee, a member of the British Humanist Association, a Labour Party supporter, and a Tottenham fan. He died in 2015 at the age of 89. He had spent the last 50 years of his life patiently explaining, to anyone who asked, that he was not Alf. Dandy Nichols, who played Els, had spent years working as a secretary in a London factory before she became an actress. She had paid for her own evening classes in drama, diction, and fencing. She was 58 when she was cast as Els. She died in 1986 at the age of 78. Anthony Booth, who played Mike, was an actual Labour activist from Liverpool. He was nearly killed in a flat fire in 1979. In 1997, his son-in-law became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Booth criticised the Blair government on the Iraq War and on pensions for the rest of his life. He died in 2017, at the age of 85 in Yorkshire. Una Stubbs, who played Rita, had been on television since the 1950s. She would, between 2010 and 2017, become Mrs. Hudson, the landlady of Sherlock Holmes, in the BBC series Sherlock. She died in Edinburgh in 2021 at the age of 84. And Alfie Bass, the East End Jewish actor whose real name was Abraham Basilinsky, played Bert Reed alongside his old Unity Theatre colleague Warren Mitchell. His own parents had fled the Russian Empire one generation earlier. These were the voices behind the bigotry. None of them was Alf. None of them voted conservative. None of them shared the opinions they spent a decade broadcasting. Till Death Us Do Part is, 60 years after it began, still the most argued about programme the BBC has ever broadcast. The arguments have not changed in 60 years. Some viewers, in 1966 and in 2022, watched Alf Garnett and saw a fool, a man whose opinions were demolished every week by his own family in his own front room. They laughed at him. They agreed with the family. They considered the show a forensic dissection of British bigotry, conducted by a Jewish actor and an Irish Catholic writer in front of 20 million viewers. Other viewers, in 1966 and in 2022, watched Alf Garnett and heard a man saying out loud the things they themselves thought in private. They quoted his lines back at Warren Mitchell in the street. They wrote letters of support to the BBC. They elected in 1979 the Conservative Party that Alf had voted for. These two audiences were watching the same programme. They were drawing exactly opposite conclusions from it. Till Death Us Do Part matters today not because it has aged well. Much of it has not. The language is, in 2026, almost impossible to broadcast in the form it was broadcast in 1966. The arguments are, in many of the early episodes, slow, repetitive, and uncomfortable. The lost episodes that returned to British television in 2022 are, by general critical agreement, harder to watch than their reputation suggested. It matters because of the question it asked. The question was, can television satirize the worst opinions of its own audience without giving those opinions a platform? The answer, in the 10-year experiment that Johnny Speight conducted on the BBC between 1965 and 1975, was, and remains, uncertain. Speight thought he was creating a fool. Some viewers thought he had created a spokesman. Television is not a courtroom. It does not deliver verdicts. It delivers instead to every viewer in every front room a character, and lets each of them decide for themselves whether the character is the joke, the warning, or the voice of something they already believed. That is why, 50 years after the last original episode was broadcast, Britain has not stopped arguing about Alf Garnett. If their story moved you, please subscribe to Cinema Peak, so the next forgotten chapter of British comedy can find you when it is ready.